What if an entire town vanished from official records overnight? What if the church, the state, and every mapmaker agreed to pretend it never existed? And what if, buried under decades of mud and silence, someone finally found proof that Hollow Creek had been real, and that something still lived there? Dr. Samuel Carter didn't believe in ghost towns. He believed in data, soil composition, oral history. As an anthropologist at Louisiana State University, his field was people, what they built, what they left behind. But when the Louisiana Historical Preservation Office contacted him in the spring of 2021, the request didn't sound like a normal archival job. "We've recovered a sealed trunk from a condemned church outside Jackson Parish. You'll want to see this yourself." Inside that trunk, beneath warped floorboards and hurricane debris, were 24 folders, their edges blackened by moisture, the ink blurred but legible. The labels were handwritten in fountain pen. Hollow Creek Mission, 1923 to 1924. The documents had survived nearly a century of storms. Inside were photographs, typed government memos, and, most disturbingly, the personal journals of Father Anthony Monroe, a Catholic missionary assigned to a rural parish in the Louisiana wetlands. The trunk smelled faintly of rot, salt, and something metallic, like rust or blood. Carter spent the next days cataloging the contents in his campus lab. The first photo he lifted from the envelope made his stomach tighten. A small clapboard church half submerged in water, cypress knees jutting like bones. In the background, a faded sign, Hollow Creek Mission. Yet when he tried to locate Hollow Creek on any modern map, it didn't exist. Old census records? Missing. Land deeds? Destroyed in a flood. Newspaper archives? The microfilm skipped directly from 1949 to 1951, as if the year 1950 had been deliberately erased. The deeper he looked, the stranger it became. State records from 1952 mentioned a sanitary quarantine zone in the region, imposed due to soil contamination and epidemic risk. But there was no pathogen named, no follow-up, no repeal notice. After that, Hollow Creek ceased to appear anywhere. Among the brittle papers, Carter found a field note written in trembling script. "Do not approach the Barrow property after sundown. They hear you before they see you." It was the first mention of the Barrow family, the name that would soon dominate every page. In Monroe's reports, they were described as a reclusive kinship unit of uncertain lineage. Locals had called them the white folk of the swamp. At first, Carter assumed the description was racist folklore, the kind of southern myth that painted isolation as sin. But then he found a photograph tucked inside one of the folders. 7 figures standing ankle-deep in water, all facing the camera. Their faces were pale, not from exposure or dust, but from the skin itself, almost translucent. The eyes caught the flash like metal. Pinned to the back of that photo was a short typed note from 1951. Subject family exhibits signs of albinism inconsistent with genetics of the region. Further study suspended by order of Parish Health Board. Carter leaned back in his chair, staring at the faded ink, the warped corners of the paper. Something about the handwriting, neat, deliberate, but uneven, as if written in haste, carried weight. These weren't campfire stories. They were records. That night, long after the lab closed, he reopened the trunk and spread the documents across the floor, trying to create a timeline. 1923 to 24. The mission reports. 1949. Parish correspondence. 1951. The quarantine. Then silence. But between the cracks, in every torn page and missing entry, there was a whisper of continuity. Someone or something had worked hard to erase Hollow Creek. Carter pressed play on the last item in the box, a warped reel-to-reel tape labeled Monroe, Session 7. The audio was faint, filtered through static, but he could make out a single phrase repeated by a trembling male voice. They were never meant to leave the water. He stopped the tape. The air in his office felt suddenly heavy, humid, as if the swamp itself had crept through the vents. Outside, Baton Rouge buzzed with its ordinary city sounds. Traffic, voices, rain on metal roofs, but Dr. Carter couldn't shake the image of that photo. 7 pale figures in the water, staring straight through the lens. And somewhere, deep beneath the cypress and the fog, Hollow Creek was waiting to be found again. March 4, 1923, Hollow Creek Mission. I was sent here to bring faith to a forgotten parish. But faith seems to have left long before I arrived. The handwriting of Father Anthony Monroe began neat, scholarly. Over the months, it devolved into something frantic, ink pressed so deep the pen tore through the paper. He wrote of a settlement swallowed by the swamp, a dozen families at most, and one clan that ruled them in silence, the Barrows. 3 sisters, Margaret, Eliza, and June. All lived with a single man, Jonas Barrow, in a weather-beaten house raised above the water. They speak softly, finish one another's thoughts. Their children do not cry. Their laughter sounds rehearsed. Monroe tried to bring the family to church. They smiled politely, declined, and invited him instead to witness what they called the true service. He followed them one night into the cypress woods. The air smelled of iron and wet leaves. The sisters stood barefoot in the shallows, chanting in tones so low they rattled the ribs. Each held a clay cup, filling it from a small spring that bubbled beneath the roots. They call it the water of the first ones, he wrote. They drink in unison. The children watch, pale, silent, eyes reflecting the moon like coins. He described the water as clear yet heavy, as if light refused to pass through it. The ceremony ended without frenzy or sacrifice, only a collective hush, the swamp itself holding its breath. A week later, he recorded that several children had fallen ill with fevers that came and went in minutes. Their skin grew almost translucent. One boy's irises shimmered gold when candlelight touched them. At night, Monroe wrote, I see their eyes before I sleep, and last night I heard voices praying in my own room, the same tones, the same rhythm. I awoke to find the floor damp. The final entry from 1923 was barely legible. They said the water remembers. I fear it now remembers me. By early 1924, Father Monroe's handwriting broke into uneven scratches. Between half-finished sentences, blotches of ink resembled fingerprints, or stains left by something wetter. His last note ended mid-phrase. The children came again tonight. They stood outside my window. They did not blink. April 12, 1924, Hollow Creek Mission. They told me blood is a circle. Break it and the gift dies. By the spring of 1924, Father Anthony Monroe's journal no longer read like a missionary's diary. It sounded like a confession written by a man who knew he was already damned. He had returned again and again to the Barrow property, each visit meant to confront, to warn, and yet each time he left more confused, more seduced by their calm certainty. The 3 sisters welcomed him as though he were family. They called him Brother Monroe. They say they are joined by the gift, bound not by sin but by purpose, he wrote. Their ancestors came from the old settlements along the bayou, people who fled the cities when the fever swept through. They drank from the spring to survive. They believed the spring chose them. He noted the strange symmetry in their generations. Every Barrow child born of the same narrow line. No outsiders, no marriages recorded, yet no decline in health or intellect. They look at me, he wrote, and I see knowledge older than books. One night he was invited again, this time deeper into the swamp. The moon hung low, blood orange behind a curtain of moss. The Barrow sisters moved barefoot through the shallows, their pale gowns dragging in the water like veils. Monroe followed, holding a lantern that flickered as though the air itself resisted light. The sound reached him before the sight. Low, rhythmic chanting, 3 voices, weaving into one. They sang to something beneath the surface, he wrote, and the water answered. From the spring rose thin bubbles, metallic in sheen. Jonas Barrow knelt before it, a knife glinting in his hand. He drew it across the throat of a small animal, a hare, perhaps, and the blood fell steaming into the pool. The sisters dipped their cups, mixing the blood with the spring water, and drank in turn. The children stood in a ring around them, eyes luminous in the dark. When Monroe's lantern caught them, their pupils tightened like a cat's, vertical, not round. The air smelled of copper, salt, and something faintly sweet, like decayed fruit. The fog itself seemed alive, he wrote. It moved against the wind, curling toward me. When it touched my skin, it burned. He tried to speak, to denounce them, but his voice came out small, swallowed by the swamp. Margaret Barrow turned toward him, smiling as if amused by his fear. You think we worship the devil, she said, but we keep the balance. The world forgets what it owes the earth. We pay that debt. When he accused them of sin, of incest, Jonas only smiled and placed a hand on the youngest sister's shoulder. June's belly was swollen beneath her dress. The gift stays strong only when the blood stays true, she whispered. Monroe fled that night, his lantern lost to the water. In his final coherent entries, he wrote that he could no longer pray without hearing echoes of their voices in his mind. June 3, 1924. The younger sister carries a child not born of man, but of their own making. I have spoken the truth aloud. They smiled when I did. They know I understand now. June 10, 1924. Something knocks beneath the floorboards of the mission at night. I fear it is not rats. His last entry, dated June 14th, was scrawled across the page in black ink mixed with mud or blood. It was hard to tell. They know. They come after sunset. The swamp moves when they breathe. If these pages are found, tell them the blood was never holy. After that, the journal fell silent. The next pages were blank, except for faint water stains shaped like fingerprints. And within a week, Hollow Creek had lost its priest. June 14, 1924, Hollow Creek, Louisiana. The last confirmed sighting of Father Anthony Monroe came just after sundown. Old parish records say he left the mission house barefoot, clutching a wooden crucifix in one hand and a lantern in the other. The caretaker tried to stop him, but Monroe only muttered, "It's inside the water now. It's listening." By nightfall, the fog rolled in thick and low, swallowing the swamp in silence. Several townsfolk later swore they saw a lone light drifting through the cypress. Steady, deliberate, moving deeper into Hollow Creek's flooded heart. He walked straight into the mire, one fisherman recalled decades later. Didn't even stumble, like something was leading him. Around midnight, screams broke the stillness. One long, tearing cry that carried across the bayou and then cut off abruptly. Moments later came another sound, faint but unmistakable. A chorus, slow and melodic, rising from somewhere within the fog. It wasn't in English or Latin. It was older, wet syllables heavy with breath, as if sung by mouths full of water. At dawn, only the priest's lantern was found, floating upright between the reeds, still burning. The church declared his death an accidental drowning. The official report described unstable terrain, likely delirium due to fever. His remains were never recovered, but locals refused the explanation. They told stories in hushed tones of seeing footprints appear in the mud days later, bare, small, and too many to belong to one man. They said at night, the mission bell would toll by itself, though its rope had long rotted away. Father Monroe's journal, discovered hidden beneath the altar weeks later, was all that remained. The final pages were warped by moisture, words smeared into veins of ink. The last sentence, still legible through the stains, read, "They sang me into the dark, and the dark answered." After his disappearance, the diocese closed the Hollow Creek mission. Within months, the rest of the settlement followed. Families abandoning their homes after livestock died and wells filled with black water. By 1926, the parish council labeled the region unfit for habitation. 2 decades later, government agents would call it a quarantine zone. Officially, Hollow Creek was cleansed, but no one ever drained the swamp. Declassified Memorandum, U.S. Army Medical Research Division, 1951. Subject: Field Anomalies, Hollow Creek Region, Project Stillwater. In the restless years of the Cold War, the United States government hunted for anything that could be weaponized: radiation, pathogens, psychic research. But buried deep within Louisiana's archives was a different concern: unexplained medical reports from the abandoned parish of Hollow Creek. The soil there, said one 1949 field note, kills nothing and preserves everything. Thus was born Operation Stillwater, an investigation masked as an agricultural survey. Leading it was Dr. Richard Halvorson, a biologist from Tulane University with a reputation for chasing impossible data. He arrived at the swamp in May of 1950 with 6 researchers, 12 soldiers, and orders to collect environmental samples of anomalous organic origin. Their base stood on the bones of the old mission, the church Father Monroe once kept. The structure was gone, replaced by military tents and gas-powered generators. Yet even the soldiers whispered about the way the night carried sound there, how the frogs stopped croaking whenever anyone mentioned the Barrow name. Halvorson's first report, dated June 3rd, was clinical. Human remains found near submersion zone B4. Tissue preservation inconsistent with time of death. Collagen intact, dermal layers elastic. Age estimate, over 50 years. Subject shows no decomposition. Within days, the team discovered traces of habitation, wood pilings in a pattern too deliberate for chance, remnants of a walkway stretching into open water. In the mud, embedded bones, human, animal, sometimes both. The genetic samples they extracted from those remains made little sense. The chromosomes showed extra sequences, redundant loops in the genome that seemed to repair themselves under laboratory stress. One intern wrote privately, "It's like the body refuses to die." Halvorson dismissed local myths but couldn't ignore the data. He noted recurring anomalies: albinism across multiple recovered skulls, an absence of tooth decay, and signs of bone regrowth even in skeletal samples. His nightly dispatches grew erratic. They may have found a biological equilibrium, an evolutionary stasis outside known science. This is no cult. This is adaptation. Then came the first incident. A patrol team reported sighting a child on the northern ridge, small, barefoot, watching them from behind the reeds. When the soldiers called out, it turned and walked away, but its movements were wrong, too smooth, deliberate, every step identical to the last. One man swore the child crossed the flooded section without sinking. They followed the prints for half a mile until they simply stopped. Not faded, stopped mid-stride. That night, 3 soldiers deserted. Halvorson tried to continue the work. His final entry, logged July 17th, read, "Sample D has begun to pulse. Under microscope, the tissue contracts at 10-second intervals. Still alive. We have sealed it in containment." I hear breathing from the specimen room at night, but ventilation shows no movement. 1 week later, the base burned. The official Army report cited generator malfunction. Locals, however, said they saw fire rising straight from the swamp, a column of orange light that did not flicker, as if the air itself had ignited. Dr. Halvorson's remains were never recovered. When the smoke cleared, the research logs were sealed under federal classification, stamped canceled biohazard risk. A surviving soldier, decades later, told his grandson a simpler story. Something came up from the water that night, and it wasn't fire that burned the camp. It was breath. After Stillwater, the government quietly redrew the maps again. Hollow Creek disappeared once more, this time not by neglect, but by design. The Barrow name might have vanished from census rolls, but it survived in rumor. By the late 1970s, those whispers reached Marian Doyle, a young journalist from Atlanta with a taste for lost American myths. She came south with a Super 8 camera and a grant from a small PBS affiliate. Her project, Ghost Towns of the Bayou. When she reached the outskirts of Hollow Creek, locals warned her to turn back. No roads past the levee, they said. No sound after dark. But Marian laughed it off. On October 3, 1977, her field diary began. Found what's left of the Barrow house. Foundations still raised on rotted pilings, vines growing through the floor. Inside, fragments of glass negatives, family portraits maybe. Faces pale, blurred, all eyes reflecting the flash like mirrors. One child clearly has 6 fingers. She wrote about the silence. How the swamp seemed to absorb her voice. How her recording mic caught faint breathing between takes even when she stood alone. On the second day, she found what looked like a makeshift grave marker. A wooden cross split by rot, with 3 initials carved by knife. J, B, E, B, M, B. She set up her camera facing it and recorded at dusk. The reel later found in her motel room shows nothing for the first 5 minutes. Just mist, the flicker of gnats, until a shape moves at the far edge of the frame. Small, pale, half-hidden in cattails. Her production notes grew erratic after that. Sentences trailed off. Spelling collapsed. Children again or something using their voices. They call my name from the water. I think they know the sound of the shutter. Neighbors in the nearest town recalled her returning 2 days later, drenched and shaking. She mailed her undeveloped film to the network, saying she was done with Hollow Creek. She disappeared that same week. Only the audio cassette remained, labeled Final Field Log. The first half was standard narration, her voice tight, deliberate. The Barrow family may have practiced genetic isolation for generations, then static, a click, and faint rustling. A whisper, distant but distinct. They are underneath. The rest was silence. When the tape was cleaned and amplified years later, engineers found one more layer beneath her voice. A murmur, low and synchronized, as though several people were breathing through the same mouth. No one ever found Marian Doyle's body, but her camera was recovered weeks later, half submerged in the mud. Its film intact, showing one last frame. The doorway of the Barrow house open wide, water lapping just inside. When the Freedom of Information Act cracked open the sealed boxes of Operation Stillwater, only fragments emerged, burned reports, mislabeled vials, and a series of blood samples marked Specimen H3. In 1983, biologist Dr. Thomas Vail at the National Genetic Research Facility in Maryland was tasked with reanalyzing the material. He expected contamination. What he found changed everything. The samples behaved wrongly. Under a microscope, red blood cells elongated, dividing and rejoining in patterns more like algae than human tissue. DNA sequencing revealed extranucleotide chains forming self-repairing loops, segments that resisted denaturing even under heat. This is not mutation, Vail wrote in his field log. It's design, something preserved across generations, a legacy, not an error. The data showed fragments of a genome unknown to modern taxonomy. The sequences carried chemical markers older than any recorded human lineage. Vail's marginal note beside one chart read simply, Precambrian. He requested comparison samples from primate and amphibian databases. The results returned blank. No match. Soon, colleagues noticed changes in him. Sleeplessness, erratic speech, the smell of swamp water clinging to his clothes though he hadn't left the lab in weeks. One assistant recalled hearing him whisper through the microscope lens, as if speaking to the cells. Audio log, April 7, 1984. They're not gone. The genes remember shape, breath, memory. They're building themselves again through us. We thought it was infection, it's inheritance. Security footage from the following month shows Vail working alone after midnight, placing the remaining vials into a small cooler. At 2:17 a.m., the lab's fire alarms triggered. Investigators found scorch marks but no trace of accelerant. The cooler was missing. All that remained was his journal, half burned at the edges, recovered from the sink. On the surviving last page, written in soot-smeared ink, "They're not human. They're coming back." The laboratory was quietly shut down. Official cause, equipment malfunction. Unofficially, the file was reclassified as environmental pathogen, non-terrestrial origin. And once again, Hollow Creek was erased from the paperwork. Not forgotten, but quarantined in memory. Hospitals keep secrets better than governments do. Files vanish, charts are rewritten, diagnoses buried under polite codes. But some stories slip through the cracks, the kind nurses whisper over coffee when they think no one is listening. One such story began in 2002 at St. Bernadette Medical Center in New Orleans. A patient arrived just after midnight, brought in by a stranger who left no name. The admitting nurse noted the details with the detached precision of habit. Male, approximately 25, severe dehydration, confused speech. But what made her pause were his eyes. Metallic gold, glowing faintly even under fluorescent light. His hands were wrapped in gauze. When the doctor unrolled the bandages, he found 6 fingers on each. Perfectly formed. The nails translucent, the skin nearly white. Congenital polydactyly, the surgeon said quickly, but no one believed him. The man spoke little. When he did, it wasn't English. The language sounded ancient, fluid, rhythmic. One orderly swore it was Latin. During an intake exam, a junior resident muttered a prayer in the same tongue. The patient lifted his head and answered fluently, voice calm, precise. Non sum infans terrae. I am not a child of the earth. Within hours, the ward began to change. The air grew damp, metallic. Nurses complained of condensation on the windows, though the AC ran full. In the night shifts, they heard what they called the water song, a faint humming echoing through the ventilation ducts, rising and falling like waves. Patients reported nightmares, standing knee-deep in dark water while unseen hands tugged at them below. One elderly man died of cardiac arrest. Before he went, he whispered, "They're calling from underneath." On the 3rd night, the golden-eyed man vanished. No alarms, no witnesses. His hospital gown lay folded neatly on the bed, sheets dry. The monitors still beeped, reading normal vitals for a patient who was no longer there. The only trace was the smell, a mix of wet soil, rust, and something sweetly decayed. Security footage failed to show him leaving. The cameras glitched between 2:03 and 2:07 a.m. replaced by static laced with faint voices, overlapping like layered breath. The hospital's incident report labeled it patient elopement, but unofficially, the staff couldn't shake what followed. Over the next weeks, several employees complained of identical dreams. Walking through fog toward a house raised on wooden stilts, hearing children sing just out of sight. Each dream ended with the same phrase whispered near their ear. "Come home to Hollow Creek." One nurse, Anna Devereux, kept a private diary. Her final entry, dated April 18, 2002, read, "I can hear the song even when I'm awake now. Comes from the drain in the floor. The water moves when no one's near it. I think he's still in the pipes." A month later, Devereux left her apartment unlocked and was never seen again. Her bathtub was filled to the brim with clear water that refused to drain. The hospital sealed Ward 3B for renovation. No staff were reassigned there. Yet custodians swore that, at night, they still heard faint singing behind the locked door. Not loud, not hostile, just persistent, like breathing turned to melody. A maintenance worker described it best. It wasn't just one voice. It was a whole choir singing through the water. Nearly a century after Father Monroe vanished, Dr. Samuel Carter stood in the same swamp, staring at the moss-covered ruins of what had once been the Hollow Creek Mission. The air was thick with insects and humidity. Even the trees seemed to lean inward, listening. Carter wasn't alone. With him were Dr. Helen Price, a molecular biologist from LSU, and Mark Layton, an archaeologist whose specialty was colonial church sites. Their permits labeled the trip as a historical survey, but the crates of lab equipment and portable genome scanners told a different story. Carter had read every line of Monroe's journal. He wanted proof. They set up camp on a ridge above the stagnant water. Beneath their feet, the mud hid decades of rot and something else. The first anomaly appeared when Layton's ground radar showed empty pockets below the mission's foundation, hollow spaces that shouldn't have existed. On the second day, they broke through a thin crust of stone and found a stairway carved directly into the bedrock. The air below was cool and dry, almost preserved. The walls glistened, coated with a thin layer of mineral film, and along them ran rows of carvings. Concentric circles, branching symbols, spirals that resembled both plants and human organs. "This isn't scripture," Layton whispered. "It's anatomy." In the largest chamber stood an altar of black limestone, etched with the same pattern seen in Barrow artifacts from the 1920s photos. When Price swabbed the surface for samples, her instruments began to hum. The cellular readings fluctuated as though the sample were alive. "It's active," she said. "Cell membranes moving. But it's rock." They collected fragments and sealed them in sterile containers. But by morning, the samples had changed. The cell structures replicated slowly, deliberately, forming new chains that mirrored human DNA. That night, Carter dreamed of water seeping through the tent seams, of voices whispering beneath the surface. When he awoke, the air smelled metallic. Helen sat outside, staring at her reflection in a puddle. Her skin had paled to a near-translucent white. "I saw us," she said, "down there, on the walls. But it wasn't us anymore." When they returned to the chamber, the carvings had changed. New symbols had appeared, 3 figures descending the stairway, identical to their silhouettes. Layton's camera documented the difference. The previous photos showed blank stone. The team grew restless. Their electronics malfunctioned. Compasses spun in circles. Insects avoided the site entirely. Carter's notes from that evening trembled with disbelief. "The symbols record us in real time. They evolve as we move." By the third night, physical symptoms spread. Helen's eyes shimmered gold under flashlight. Layton's hands shook uncontrollably. Under his nails, thin membranes of webbing began to form. Carter wrote that his pulse slowed unnaturally, each heartbeat echoing through his body like water pressure. "We are being rewritten," he noted. "Our cells reorganize themselves to match the pattern on the walls." When he checked the samples again, they no longer resembled any human genome, yet their sequence was identical to the blood records of Operation Stillwater. Carter tried to radio for evacuation, but the transmission returned only his own voice, distorted, layered, repeating the same phrase in perfect unison. "Stay with us." On the morning of August 6, 2021, the team's logs ended. Their tents stood intact, food untouched, equipment sealed. The only anomaly was inside the stone chamber. 3 new carvings, figures with elongated skulls, standing upright, hands joined, eyes like molten gold. And beneath them, freshly cut words in English. "They remembered us." For the first few days after the discovery, Dr. Samuel Carter tried to keep the team functioning. He logged every symptom, every whisper, every inexplicable shift in the carvings. But soon, the world around them began to change in ways that couldn't be measured. Trees leaned at perfect right angles toward the swamp, their roots twisting into spiral patterns. The current of the bayou no longer followed its bed. The water curled in precise circles, as though obeying invisible geometry. Even insects flew in synchronized swarms, tracing lines that resembled the markings on the chamber walls. Helen Price stopped sleeping. She would stand for hours facing the forest, murmuring in a language none of them knew. Mark Layton began sketching diagrams of the human skeleton fused with plant roots, calling it the bridge form. Carter's journal entries turned cryptic. "The order is revealing itself. The earth is aligning. We were never the first." By the 5th night, the voices returned, clear, layered, melodic. They came not from the air but from the ground itself, vibrating through the soil, through the water, through bone. "We are returning," they said, "and you, Samuel, are our threshold." He recorded everything on his field recorder. The final tape was recovered later, distorted but audible. Carter's voice trembles between fascination and dread. "They're not gone. They're waiting beneath Hollow Creek." After that, silence. A week later, local police responded to an anonymous call, reporting strange lights in the swamp. They found the team's campsite intact, tents zipped, food preserved. Cameras and notebooks lay stacked neatly beside the old mission foundation. But there were no footprints leading away, only faint ripples spreading across the still water, glowing faintly gold. Witnesses said the light shimmered beneath the surface for hours, pulsing like a heartbeat. When dawn came, the swamp was quiet again. Documented afterward, U.S. Geological Survey, 2024. Satellite imaging confirms structural anomalies in the Hollow Creek Basin. Vegetation patterns exhibit geometric uniformity inconsistent with natural growth. Thermal scans reveal low-frequency luminescence across a 3-mile radius. The wetlands are emitting light, and so the file ends not with a conclusion but with a question. If the Barrow bloodline was never human, if their design was survival, then Hollow Creek was never a ruin. It was a seed, and now it has begun to bloom.